The cold winds of Navarre howled against the stone walls of the palace in the winter of 1386. The people whispered in hushed tones about their ruler, Charles II of Navarre, a man history would remember not for his power, but for the terror of his final days. Charles was not a beloved king. He was cunning, ambitious, and often cruel. Born into privilege, he spent his life weaving webs of betrayal. His nickname, Charles the Bad, was not an exaggeration. He plotted against kings, betrayed allies, and earned enemies across both France and Castile. Yet, for all his cunning, he could not escape the judgment of time. By his mid-50s, Charles was no longer the sharp-eyed monarch he once was. His body had begun to fail him. A mysterious illness consumed him. Some say it was leprosy, others claim it was syphilis or gangrene. His skin darkened, his flesh festered, and sores spread like fire. His own courtiers spoke of a king who was rotting alive, eaten by disease from within. The once feared ruler became a living corpse in his own court, his presence a reminder of decay and mortality. Physicians and priests were summoned, but none dared to tell him the truth, that no medicine could halt the curse consuming him. Still, Charles demanded treatments. He was not ready to surrender to death. He ordered his physicians to try everything, no matter how painful, no matter how desperate. And so began the final, gruesome chapter of his life. The winter winds of Navarre in the year 1386 were harsher than usual. Bitter gusts rushed down from the Pyrenees, carrying with them the scent of pine and the chill of death. Snow piled in the courtyards of the royal palace, a silence falling over the city of Pamplona, as though the world itself was holding its breath. But inside the stone walls of the royal residence, no silence could be found. Whispers filled every chamber, spreading like wildfire. Courtiers leaned close to one another, their lips trembling as they repeated the same dreadful phrase, "The king is rotting alive." At first, it was dismissed as exaggeration, the kind of tale the common folk invented to make sense of things they could not understand. Kings were not like ordinary men. They carried with them an air of immortality, a sense that they stood above decay and weakness. But then came the smell. It began subtly, a faint soreness that clung to the tapestries of the king's chambers. Servants reported it to the steward, but he silenced them quickly, warning that to speak against the king's condition was treason. Yet the odor spread. No incense, no perfume, no braziers of burning herbs could mask it. It was the smell of corruption, flesh turning against itself. The courtiers began to notice changes in their monarch. Charles VI of Navarre, known throughout Europe as Charles the Bad, had once been a man of sharp eyes and a commanding presence. His hair, though touched with silver, still gleamed in the firelight. He had carried himself with arrogance, his shoulders straight, his voice carrying authority even in a whisper. But now he rarely left his bed. His once firm hands trembled, his skin darkened in patches, and his gait, when he managed to rise, was uneven, as though each step was a war against pain. His courtiers had seen kings fall ill before, but this was different. His face bore sores that refused to heal, his legs swelled and cracked, and at times it seemed as though his flesh itself was loosening, as if slipping from the bone. The physicians, summoned from the far reaches of France, Castile, and even Italy, gathered in secret chambers to discuss his malady. Some whispered of leprosy, that dreaded disease that exiled men from towns and cursed them to wander as living ghosts. Others argued it was syphilis, a punishment from God for his countless sins. A few dared to suggest poisoning, for Charles had made enemies enough to fill every kingdom of Europe. But the truth was more horrifying. His body was decaying while he still breathed. The court of fear life inside the palace grew unbearable. Servants carried trays of food, but dared not look at their master. They shuffled quickly, their heads lowered, fearing both his wrath and the sight of his condition. Some claimed they saw worms crawling in his bed sheets, though such stories were dismissed as nightmares born of fear. Noblemen who once jostled for the king's favor now avoided his chambers. They sent messengers instead of attending him themselves. Even his closest advisers stayed only as long as necessary, their eyes watering from the stench. But Charles himself remained as proud and sharp-tongued as ever. He would not admit weakness. When his chamberlain begged him to rest, he spat. "Do you think a king can rot before his crown has passed? I am not a corpse, I am Navarre." And yet, in private moments, he was heard to groan prayers that bordered on blasphemy. At night, his cries echoed through the stone halls. The courtiers spoke of those cries in whispers, not the groans of pain, but the screams of a man who felt hell itself clawing at his skin. Rumors flourished beyond the palace. The people of Navarre believed their king was cursed. Mothers warned their children not to wander near the palace gates. lest the plague that devoured him seep through the air. Priests gave sermons declaring that Charles's fate was divine punishment for his treacheries. After all, he had earned his epithet, the bad, through decades of deceit, betrayal, and cruelty. This was no ordinary illness, they said. This was justice made flesh. The first signs, the true discovery of the horror, came not from a physician, nor a noble, but a servant girl. Her name was Sybil, scarcely 14. A scullery maid tasked with cleaning the king's chambers at night when he slept. She was used to the smells of sickness. She had scrubbed floors after bleeding sessions, carried away linens stained with pus and sweat. But on one bitter night in December, as she entered the chamber with her bucket and rags, she froze. The king lay asleep, but the moonlight spilling through the window revealed something unnatural. His bandages had slipped from his leg, and what lay beneath made her drop her bucket with a clang. His flesh was blackened, mottled with green, as though it were meat left too long in the sun. The skin had split, and from the wound seeped a dark liquid that stained the sheets. She swore she saw movement, tiny white things writhing within the wound. Her scream woke the king. His eyes snapped open, blazing with fury. "Out!" he roared, his voice still strong despite his broken body. Guards rushed in, dragging the girl away before she could speak another word. But she had seen enough. She whispered her story to the other servants, and by morning, the entire palace buzzed with the tale the king's body was rotting alive. The physicians' desperation, the council of physicians, now faced with undeniable evidence, panicked. They prescribed endless remedies, hot baths infused with herbs, the application of honey to the wounds, poultices of wine and vinegar, bleeding to draw out corrupt humours. One even suggested wrapping the king's entire body in linen soaked in brandy, claiming the alcohol would preserve him. Charles agreed, his desperation eclipsing his dignity. Servants wound the bandages tightly, layer after layer, until he resembled a corpse prepared for burial. But none of it helped. His condition worsened. The rotting spread from his legs to his torso, his arms, his face. He stank of death, a moving, breathing corpse who ruled from a bed of agony. His voice grew raspier, though his words remained cruel. "You will not let me die," he snarled at his physicians. "Find a cure, or I will see your heads on spikes." The irony was bitter. The man who had ordered executions without mercy now kept his healers prisoner in their own failure. Whispers of punishment by January. The discovery was undeniable even beyond the palace walls. Pamplona's streets swirled with rumors. The people believed God himself had condemned their king, striking him with a punishment that no blade, no poison, no rebellion could match. He betrayed France, some muttered. He betrayed Castile. He betrayed his own allies. Now the earth betrays him. Others swore they had seen visions, ravens circling the palace, shadows flickering in the windows at night, lights like fire dancing on the ramparts. Priests warned that the king's curse might spread to the kingdom. When a ruler is diseased, so too is the land he governs, they preached. Farmers prayed their crops would not fail, that God would not scorch their fields in his wrath. But among the common folk, there was also dark satisfaction. For years, Charles had ruled with cruelty, exploiting his people for his ambitions. Now, at last, they saw justice unfold, not in war, not in rebellion, but in the slow, agonizing collapse of his flesh. The king's own terror, Charles the Bad, was not a man who feared easily. He had stared down armies, plotted against monarchs, and played the great game of power without flinching. But as his body betrayed him, fear consumed him. He began to see visions. At night, he raved that demons crawled upon his skin, gnawing at his wounds. He shouted that the souls of those he had betrayed, French lords, Castilian knights, even his own kin, gathered at the foot of his bed, their hollow eyes watching, waiting. "Get them out!" he would scream, thrashing against his bindings. "They wait for me like vultures." The priests tried to comfort him, urging him to confess his sins, but Charles refused. "Confession is for the weak." He spat, though his lips trembled. And yet, he knew the truth. He was dying, not by sword, not by poison, but by something worse. Something that left him time to reflect on every betrayal, every cruelty, every drop of blood he had spilled. His death was not swift. It was a mirror held to his soul. The discovery beyond the palace, the greatest horror of all, came when envoys from France and Castile arrived to negotiate with Navarre. They had expected a cunning ruler, weakened but still dangerous. Instead, they were led into a chamber where the air stank of decay. There, on a bed of silk stained with pus, lay Charles the Bad. His face was unrecognizable, his eyes sunken, his lips split and bleeding. His flesh looked melted, eaten away by unseen jaws. One envoy fainted at the sight. Another crossed himself furiously, muttering prayers. Word spread back to their courts, and soon Europe knew the truth: the King of Navarre was rotting alive. The discovery was complete, undeniable, irreversible. What began as whispers had become a fact etched in the memory of all who had seen it: a king, powerful and feared, reduced to a body that betrayed him day by day. And though his fate was sealed, though his body crumbled, the cruelest end had not yet come. For history would remember that Charles the Bad's final chapter was not death by disease alone, but by fire, a fire that would devour what the rot had spared. The palace stank of sickness. Servants covered their noses when they entered the king's chamber, for the odor of rotting flesh clung to the air like a curse. Charles lay on his bed, his body covered in bandages soaked with oils and herbs. His skin peeled, his muscles wasted, and his voice grew weaker each day. Yet his mind remained sharp enough to lash out at anyone who dared show pity. Whispers spread through Navarre: their king was no longer a man, but a corpse that refused to die. Rumors claimed his body was eaten by worms while he still breathed, that his eyes burned with madness, and that his soul was already damned. The physicians prescribed bizarre remedies. They blood him, they covered him with hot cloths soaked in wine. They even wrapped his body in resin smeared with ointments to preserve what little flesh remained. But none of it worked. The king screamed in agony as his own body betrayed him. By now, Charles could not stand. He was carried from chamber to chamber, wrapped tightly in linen strips like a mummy. He begged for release, yet in the same breath cursed death for approaching too slowly. The court was divided. Some prayed for his recovery, fearing the chaos of succession. Others prayed for his death, unable to endure the stench of their rotting king. But no one, no physician, no priest, no servant, could imagine how cruel and horrific his end would truly be. The discovery of King Charles's affliction did not end with the frightened gasp of a servant or the whispered prayers of physicians. It grew, like the rot itself, spreading through the palace, the city, and finally the whole of Europe. What began as rumor now became undeniable fact. The King of Navarre was rotting while he still breathed. The Palace of Silence once, the royal palace of Pamplona, had been a place of constant noise. The chatter of courtiers scheming in corridors, the clatter of servants rushing through the kitchens, the laughter of musicians and dancers summoned to entertain their sovereign. But as the weeks passed and the king's condition worsened, silence fell upon its halls. The courtiers spoke only in whispers, as though the walls themselves might betray them. The servants walked lightly, terrified that the king might hear them mutter of his stench. The great tapestries and gilded candelabra seemed to mock the reality within. Behind those splendid walls lay a monarch who had become a prisoner of his own decaying body. At night, the silence was broken by screams. Charles's cries, ragged and desperate, echoed down the corridors. Sometimes he shouted for mercy, sometimes he cursed unseen demons, sometimes he roared in rage at his own physicians. These cries carried far beyond the bedchamber, reaching the ears of terrified servants huddled together in the lower halls. They would cross themselves, whisper prayers, and hope the night would end. The palace, once the symbol of royal strength, had become a mausoleum. The burden of the physicians had thought themselves honored when summoned to treat a king. Now, they felt trapped in a nightmare. Each day they entered his chamber, carrying their satchels of herbs, knives, and bottles of foul-smelling concoctions. Each day they were met not only with the smell of rot, but with the glare of their patient, whose sharp eyes had lost none of their menace. "You will cure me," Charles hissed one morning, his voice thin but commanding. "I am a king, not a peasant to be buried in filth. Find me a remedy, or I will see you hanged for treason." The physicians bowed and murmured reassurances, but among themselves they despaired. They had tried everything: bleeding to balance his humors, poultices of honey and vinegar, baths of warm wine, fumigations with exotic herbs imported at great expense. Nothing slowed the corruption. His flesh continued to blacken, his wounds continued to seep, and the stench grew unbearable. One physician suggested drastic measures: that they cut away the rotting flesh with knives, as one might carve rot from an apple. Another countered that such an act would kill him outright, for the corruption ran too deep. In the end, they did nothing but continue their futile treatments, more for fear of the king's wrath than hope of a cure. At night, they gathered together, pale and exhausted, speaking in hushed voices. They knew what the servants whispered, that this was no illness, but divine judgment. And in their hearts, though they dared not admit it, they began to believe it too. The priests and the curse. If the physicians could not save him, perhaps the priests could. At least, That was the hope whispered in the corridors. The priests of Navarre entered his chamber bearing crosses, holy water, and relics of saints. They chanted psalms, sprinkled his body, and urged him to confess. But Charles, proud even in agony, spat at them. "I need no priest," he rasped. "I need no forgiveness. My crown absolves me." But when the priests returned later, they found him raving, eyes wide with terror. "They are here," he muttered, pointing with trembling fingers to the shadows at the foot of his bed. "The dead. They wait for me." The priests insisted he confess, but Charles laughed bitterly. "Confess? Do you think God has not already written my sins? Do you think your muttered prayers can change the ink?" Still, the priests returned day after day. They, too, began to believe the whispers that the king was cursed. Some said it was the work of witches, others that it was the vengeance of God himself. One priest claimed that the king's soul was already in hell, and only his body remained above the earth. A vessel condemned to decay before death. When this tale reached the city, it spread like wildfire. The people began to gather outside the palace walls, crossing themselves and muttering that their ruler was damned. Mothers warned their children to stay away, lest the curse of Charles the Bad seep into their own flesh. The servants' burden, no one suffered more than the servants who tended the king daily. They carried his chamber pots, heavy with foul, smelling waste. They changed his bandages, gagging as they peeled away cloth soaked in pus and blood. They scrubbed his floors and linens, burning herbs in a vain attempt to cleanse the air. Some servants begged to be released from duty. A few fled the palace altogether, disappearing into the countryside. Those who remained did so from fear. Fear of the king's wrath, fear of punishment, fear of the curse that seemed to linger in the air. The young servant girl Sable, who had first seen the horror of his leg, was kept away from the king after her scream. Yet she continued to whisper her tale to others, and in time, it spread through the entire palace. Every servant knew their king's body was no longer truly alive. The nobles of Navarre faced a grim dilemma. On the one hand, they feared the king's death, for it would plunge the kingdom into uncertainty. Succession would be contested, alliances tested, wars perhaps kindled. On the other hand, they feared his continued life even more, for how could a kingdom prosper when its sovereign lay in bed, a rotting corpse who terrified his own court? In council, they argued endlessly. Some urged secrecy, demanding that the king's condition be hidden from foreign envoys. Others insisted it was already too late, for rumors had spread across Europe. Envoys from France and Castile had already carried tales of horror back to their kings. Charles of Navarre was no longer feared as a cunning schemer. He was pitied as a grotesque, a warning from God of what became of the wicked. The nobles whispered that perhaps it would be better if the king died swiftly, even if by unnatural means. But none dared act, for Charles, though broken in body, remained sharp in mind. He sensed their hesitation, and his eyes burned with suspicion. "You wait for me to die," he accused one day, glaring at his council. "But I will not grant you the pleasure. I will live, if only to spite you." And the nobles, cowed, bowed their heads. The people's judgment outside the palace walls. The people of Navarre watched and waited. They had never loved Charles the Bad. His taxes were heavy, his wars constant, his betrayals infamous. He had enriched himself while they labored, schemed while they starved. Now, at last, they saw justice unfold before their eyes. Word spread of his condition, the blackened skin, the stench, the cries at night. Some claimed they had seen ravens circling above the palace, others that ghostly lights danced in the windows after midnight. Farmers swore their fields would not grow until the king was dead, that the land itself rejected his rule. Yet there was also fear. For if the king was cursed, perhaps the curse would not end with him. Perhaps it would seep into the soil, into the people, into the very stones of Navarre. At night, families prayed for his death, not out of cruelty, but out of desperation. They believed only his passing could cleanse the land. The king's reflection in his chamber, Charles wrestled with terror. He had been a man of power, feared across kingdoms, a player of great games of betrayal and war. He had stood against France, against Castile, against allies and enemies alike. He had been cunning, ruthless, and unyielding. But now, lying in bed with his body crumbling, he began to see himself clearly. Each sore, each patch of blackened skin, seemed to him a tally of his sins. Each scream at night echoed with the voices of those he had wronged. His body had become a canvas upon which his sins were written, visible, undeniable, grotesque. Sometimes he wept, though he would never admit it. Sometimes he begged God for mercy, though he spat on priests in the day. And sometimes he simply stared at the ceiling, waiting wondering how much longer he would endure. The discovery beyond Navarre by early 1387. The discovery was no longer confined to the palace, or even to Navarre. Across Europe, people spoke of the rotting king. In France, they mocked him as a corpse who refused to die. In Castile, they whispered that it was divine punishment for his treachery. In England, they told the tale as a warning that kings, too, were mortal, and that sin could not be hidden beneath a crown. Poets composed verses about his suffering. Priests preached sermons about his fate. Children played games in the streets, pretending to rot like the King of Navarre. His name, once feared, became a byword for horror. Charles the Bad, the king who rotted alive, the final foreshadowing. Yet, even as his body decayed, fate had not finished with him. The rot was only the beginning, the prelude to a death so cruel that it would eclipse everything that had come before. For in January of 1387, as his physicians prepared a final desperate treatment to soothe him into Lennon soaked in strong spirits, a careless act would ignite the end, and the king who had rotted alive would burn. It was in January of 1387 that the king's final treatment was prepared. His physicians ordered that his failing body be tightly sewn into a sheet soaked in strong spirits, believing it would preserve what little life he had left. The king, desperate and delirious, agreed. The servants wrapped him carefully, binding him like a corpse ready for burial. But then came the mistake. Whether by accident or by the cruel hand of fate, one servant held a candle too close. The linen, soaked in alcohol, caught fire instantly. In moments, flames consumed the king's bed. His screams tore through the palace halls, shrieks of agony as fire devoured the flesh that disease had not yet claimed. Courtiers rushed in, horrified, but the blaze spread too quickly. Some tried to smother the fire, but Charles thrashed wildly, feeding the flames with every desperate movement. By dawn, the king was gone, reduced to ashes and blackened bones. The people whispered that it was justice. A man called Charles the Bad had met an end befitting his name, rotting alive, then burning to death by his own cure. Historians would debate whether his final moments were accident or divine punishment, but one truth remained. The horrific death of Charles Stuckeroo of Navarre would echo through the centuries as one of the most gruesome royal demises in history. The Palace of Pamplona had long since become a house of dread. By the opening weeks of 1387, the king's sickness was no longer whispered rumor, but a living nightmare that consumed every corridor, every chamber, every life within its walls. Charles Tibreu of Navarre, Charles the Bad, had wasted away into something that could hardly be called a man. His courtiers kept their distance, his servants trembled at his bedside, his physicians despaired, and his priests muttered prayers with more fear than faith. The discovery was complete. Their king was not merely dying, he was decaying alive. And yet, even in that state, fate had reserved for him an end so cruel, so grotesque, that it would echo through the centuries. The king's last weeks in January of 1387. Charles's condition had reached its most dreadful stage. The rot that had begun on his legs had spread across his body. His arms were mottled with black patches, his skin peeled in strips, his breath came with a foul stench that no herb or incense could mask. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, had sunken deep into his skull, ringed with purple shadows. His lips cracked and bled, and when he spoke, the words came hoarse and bitter, like the croak of a raven. And yet his mind, though fevered and filled with visions, remained sharp enough to lash out. When a servant recoiled at the sight of his sores, he snarled, "Look well, girl. This is the face of a king. Even in death, you will bow before me." When a physician suggested that he prepare for confession, he spat, "I will confess to no man. Do you think your God has not already judged me? He lets me live. That is his judgment." But in his private hours, when the chamber was quiet and the candles flickered low, Charles whispered words that betrayed his terror. He called for his mother, dead for decades. He begged unseen figures to leave his bedside. He wept openly, though only the silent walls bore witness. The desperation of the court of Navarre was paralyzed. The nobles debated endlessly. Should they hide his condition? Should they announce his imminent death? Should they prepare for succession? Each decision seemed fraught with peril. Envoys from abroad already carried tales of horror. France mocked the once dangerous schemer who now lay a prisoner of his own body. Castile pointed to his fate as proof that betrayal brought divine punishment. Even in distant England, storytellers whispered of the rotting king, a parable for children who disobeyed. Within the palace, the courtiers no longer schemed for power. They prayed for release, not for their king's sake, but for their own. For his suffering had become their burden as well, a shadow that hung over the kingdom. The final remedy, It was then that his physicians proposed one final treatment. They reasoned that if the corruption came from the flesh, perhaps it could be halted by sealing the body itself. They devised a remedy unlike any before. The king would be wrapped tightly in sheets of fine linen, each strip soaked in strong spirits. The alcohol, they argued, would purify and preserve his body, sealing the rot within. Charles, desperate, consented. He had endured bleeding, honey vinegar, wine baths, fumigations, all failures. Perhaps this, bizarre though it sounded, would give him reprieve. The servants gathered, trembling, as they prepared the treatment. They laid out the linen strips, soaking them in brandy until the fabric dripped. Then they began to wind them around the king's wasted body. First his legs, thin and blackened. Then his torso, where sores wept through the cloth. Then his arms, trembling with fever. Finally, his chest and head, until only his mouth remained uncovered, gasping for air. When they were finished, Charles lay upon his bed like a mummy, bound tightly in alcohol-soaked wrappings. For a moment there was silence. The physicians exchanged wary glances. Perhaps, just perhaps, this would hold back the rot, but fate had other plans. The fire happened swiftly, cruelly, almost absurdly. One of the servants, exhausted from hours of labor, approached with a candle to seal the final knot of the linen. In his clumsiness, or perhaps by divine hand, the flame brushed too close to the alcohol-soaked cloth. In an instant, fire leapt from the wick to the wrappings. The linen ignited as though it were oil. Flames raced across the king's body, devouring the strips of cloth, feeding on the spirits within. Within seconds, Charles the Bad was ablaze. His scream tore through the palace. Servants dropped their tools in horror. Physicians scrambled for water, for blankets, for anything to smother the fire. But the flames spread too quickly. The king thrashed wildly, his bindings turning his desperate struggle into a grotesque dance of fire. The smell of burning flesh filled the chamber, worse than anything that had come before. The courtiers outside heard the screams and recoiled in terror, some fleeing the palace altogether. "Help me!" he shrieked, his voice breaking into raw, animal cries. But no one could help him. By the time the flames were smothered, it was too late. What remained on the bed was not a man but a charred husk, blackened and twisted. The once proud king who had schemed and betrayed, who had ruled with cunning and cruelty, was reduced to ashes and bone. Charles the Bad was dead. The aftermath in the palace silence fell after his screams ended. The servants wept in terror. The physicians stood stunned, their faces ashen. The nobles, when told of his death, crossed themselves and muttered prayers, though some did so with thinly veiled relief. The priests declared it a judgment from God, a punishment befitting his sins. They refused to bury him with the rites of a sainted king. Instead, his body, or what little remained of it, was laid in a plain coffin. Few dared approach it, for even in death, the stench lingered. Within days his passing was announced to the people of Navarre. The news spread quickly. Their king had perished not by illness or battle, but by fire, his body consumed in his own chamber. The people responded with a strange mix of pity and grim satisfaction. Many saw it as justice. The king who had rotted alive had finally burned, his sins carried away in smoke. Mothers warned their children, "Do not be cruel, do not betray, or you will end like Charles the Bad." The legacy of horror across Europe, his fate became a tale repeated in hushed voices. Chroniclers wrote of his rotting flesh, his cries at night, his fiery end. Poets turned his death into allegory, a story of pride brought low. Priests used it as a sermon, proof that no crown could protect a soul from judgment. Some said his end was an accident, the foolish error of a servant with a candle. Others swore it was divine punishment, that God himself had guided the flame. A few whispered it was the work of enemies within the palace, eager to rid themselves of a cursed king. But one truth was beyond debate: his death was unlike any other. Charles the Bad became immortal not through conquest or glory, but through horror. He was remembered not as a king who ruled, but as a king who rotted, who burned, who died in screams and flames. The moral of a rotten king. In the years that followed, the story of Charles the Bad became legend. He was spoken of less as a monarch and more as a warning. His name was invoked in sermons and tales. Do not betray, or you will rot like Charles the Bad. Do not blaspheme, or you will burn like Charles the Bad. His palace, long after his death, was said to be haunted by the smell of decay. Travelers whispered that at night, the cries of the burning king could still be heard echoing through the halls. His descendants ruled after him, but the stain of his death lingered. His curse became their inheritance, his story their burden. And so, the discovery of his fate was passed down through generations. The tale of the king who decayed alive, whose final remedy turned into a funeral pyre, whose legacy was eternal shame. The final discovery: history remembers kings for their victories, their conquests, their laws. But Charles II of Navarre is remembered for something else entirely. His discovery was not of new lands or great truths, but of the inescapable truth of mortality. He discovered, in his final days, that power cannot shield flesh from decay, that crowns cannot protect against divine justice, that pride cannot silence the screams of death. And we, centuries later, still repeat his story, because it is not merely the story of a king, it is the story of a man who believed himself untouchable, only to find that even the greatest among us can rot, can burn, can fall to ruin. Thus ended Charles the Bad, a king who schemed, betrayed, and ruled with cruelty, but whose true legacy was written in the screams of his final night. The discovery was complete. The world had seen what became of him, and the world would never forget.